The night the whispers rose. There was a darkness deeper than night that settled over Oakwood Plantation. For years, the grand house with its towering columns and sprawling fields had been a symbol of wealth and power. The white family that ruled it, the Carvers, were feared by everyone in the nearby towns. They treated their slaves not as people, but as property, cattle to be worked, beaten, and broken. But on this particular night, something had shifted. An ancient, unspeakable power stirred beneath the land in the very soil drenched with blood and sweat. The slaves of Oakwood had known pain, torment, and hopelessness, but they also knew something else, a secret passed down through generations, a forgotten ritual. And tonight, they would use it. It began with whispers, the kind that slithered between the cracks of the wooden shacks where the slaves slept, though none of them were sleeping. The whispers were old, older than the plantation, older than the Carver family line. They were the voices of ancestors, of spirits long buried in the unforgiving soil of the South. Isaac, an elder among the slaves, was the first to hear them clearly. He had been waiting for this moment all his life. He had seen too many friends die under the lash of a whip, too many families torn apart, too many souls broken. His hands, though calloused and worn, held the power of knowledge that had been whispered in his ear by his grandmother and by her grandmother before her. It was time. Late that night, when the overseers had gone back to their cabins and the Carvers were asleep in their great house, Isaac gathered the others. By the light of the moon, they moved silently, their feet barely stirring the dust. There was no fear now, only purpose. The air around them felt thick, charged with a power they could feel but not see. Isaac led them to a clearing deep in the woods, far from the eyes of the white men. A circle was drawn to the earth, and at its center was a pile of bones, ancient relics of those who had been stolen from Africa, their spirits trapped in this strange, brutal land. Isaac knelt and began to chant, his deep voice rising and falling in rhythm with the pulse of the earth beneath them. The others joined in, their voices harmonizing into something primal, something raw. The wind began to pick up, though the air was hot and still. The trees around them swayed, groaning as though in pain. And then, from the ground itself, a mist began to rise, swirling within the circle. It was thick, almost alive, like the breath of the dead. The chanting grew louder, more insistent, until the mist coalesced into shapes, shadowy figures, human but not. These were the spirits of the ancestors, those who had died with their rage unspent, their revenge unfinished. The slaves fell silent as the spirits moved toward them. Isaac stood, his eyes locked on the figures as they circled him. They whispered to him, their voices like the rustle of leaves in the wind. He nodded, understanding. It was time to take back what had been stolen. Back at the plantation house, the Carvers slept soundly, unaware of the terror that was about to unfold. The house itself, with its grand windows and heavy wooden doors, seemed to shudder as the mist crept toward it, like the claws of some unseen beast. The windows rattled, though there was no breeze. The doors groaned on their hinges, though no one touched them. Inside, the youngest of the Carver sons, Thomas, stirred in his bed. He heard a noise, soft like the hum of bees, but far more menacing. His eyes snapped open, and for a moment, he thought he saw something in the corner of his room, a shadow. He blinked, but it was gone. His heart raced as he sat up, wiping the sweat from his brow. But then the sound came again, louder this time, like a voice speaking directly into his mind. He tried to call out, but no sound came. His mouth moved, but his voice was gone, stolen by the very air around him. Slowly the shadow returned, this time growing larger, darker, until it filled the entire room. Thomas could feel it pressing in on him, suffocating him with its presence. Down the hall, Mr. Carver woke with a start. He, too, felt the strange heaviness in the air. As he reached for the lantern by his bed, the flame inside it flickered out, plunging the room into darkness. A low rumble echoed through the house, and then the screams began. Thomas's cries echoed down the hallway, followed by the sound of something heavy hitting the floor. Mr. Carver rushed out of his room, only to be met with a sight that made his blood run cold. His son's body was lying on the ground, his face twisted in terror, his eyes wide and glassy. Standing over him was a figure, a woman, her skin as dark as night, her eyes glowing with an unnatural light. She smiled, a slow, deliberate smile, before fading into the mist. Panic gripped Mr. Carver as he stumbled back into the hallway. He could hear the whispers now, growing louder, coming from every corner of the house. His wife was screaming from her room, but when he burst through the door, all he found was her empty bed, the sheets soaked in blood. One by one, the Carvers fell. The spirits moved through the house like a storm, relentless and vengeful. They had been wronged in life, and now, in death, they would have their justice. The mist thickened, swallowing the house whole, until all that could be heard were the final, pitiful screams of the Carver family. By dawn, the plantation was silent. The grand house stood empty, its once pristine white walls stained with blood. The fields, too, were quiet. No overseers barked orders, no whips cracked through the air. The slaves, now free, stood in the clearing once more. The spirits had returned to the earth, their vengeance fulfilled. Isaac stood at the center, his face calm, though his eyes gleamed with the knowledge that the balance had been restored. The sun rose over Oakwood Plantation, but it was not the same place. The land had taken back what was owed. And from that day on, no one dared speak of the Carvers. The plantation stood abandoned, a haunted relic of a time when the oppressed had risen, not just in life, but from beyond the grave.